Hi everyone, it's Erin from the Provincial Farmhouse. In today's video, I've put together a collection of 8 altered book projects for you to try. For my first project, I'm going to be using this hardcover book that I thrifted. I'm going to be using Paint Couture's Premium Plus 2-in-1 primer in grey. I'm going to apply it with a paintbrush. I'm going to be applying it to the entire outside of the book, and I'm going to be doing 2 coats. Adding the primer is going to ensure that my paint is going to stick well, but it's also going to block the writing that's on the spine there from coming up through my other layers of paint, and also it will block any stains just in case there's stains on the book that I can't see. Once my primer is completely dry, I am then going to take out Paint Couture's embossing medium, and I'm going to be working with this stencil that I had in my stash. I'm applying the embossing medium with a palette knife just over the top of this fleur-de-lis design. I got a little bit in a section that I didn't want, but that is pretty easily fixed up. I'm then going to come in and add it to the right-hand side as well. Any areas that I get it where I don't want, I'll scrape off the excess, and then also I can use a wet wipe as well. Next, you can see that I have flipped the book upside down so that the wet embossing medium is out of the way, and I'm applying the same stencil in the other 2 corners. Once the designs in the corners are completely dry, I then took the same stencil and I'm just adding the embossing medium over the top of the script design. I don't want this to be perfect. I want it to be sort of looking like broken text, and I'm going to randomly position this text over the front cover of the book. Now these designs are going to be painted over, they're not going to be a main focus, but I am just layering in some interesting elements to give my piece more depth. I let the embossing medium dry completely and then took out my Redesign Sorrento Laurels mold. I'm going to add some cornstarch to the center design. I'm then going to be working air dry clay into the design. You can see I'm rolling it up first, and then I'm starting to press it into the details, and I'll be using my fingers and pushing the clay out to the left and right until I have a clean line. I'm then going to bend and flex the mold and then flip it over, and gravity is going to help me get the design out. Now this is very intricate, very thin pieces, so I did have a little bit of breakage, but this is very easily fixed and you can glue them back together. I'm then going to apply some wood glue to the back of my casting and position it on the spine of the book. To glue down the rest of the design, I added my glue directly to the spine of the book where the mold is going to go. That just made it a little bit easier to ensure that I had all of the area covered. It was all glued down really well. I'm then going to be pressing down the mold to make sure I've got good contact and also shaping it to the shape of the spine. I let my castings dry, and now I'm using Paint Couture's Duck Egg chalk paint. I'm going to be adding that over the top of the front section of the book first. You can see I'm applying the paint and I'm adjusting the direction of my brush strokes to make sure that I'm getting that paint into the details of the embossed design, and I'm going to be applying 2 even coats. When the duck egg paint was dry, I moved on to Farmhouse Linen chalk paint by Paint Couture, and I'm going to be applying this to the spine of the book and over the top of the castings, and also to the back section of the book. I'm not too worried if I get paint in the duck egg section because I could wipe it off with a wet wipe, or I could go back over the top of it with that duck egg color. When my paint was completely dry, I then took out Redesign's Salon Diane transfer. I've already cut this out. I've already used this transfer before. I'm just positioning that down the bottom there and then pressing down. I'm using the transfer stick that comes with the transfer to rub and burnish that design down. And you'll see I'm sort of going over the entire design first to make sure it's adhered down, and then I've picked up a corner and I'm rubbing as I am lifting that plastic up. Now this was a little bit more involved because I do have the raised stenciling underneath, so I definitely had to make sure that I had all of that transfer down and secured properly, especially over those uneven areas. On the right you can see I just trimmed off the excess transfer there. I can use that elsewhere, and I'm just going to continue until I have the whole design transferred down. When I had the whole transferred down, I then used the plastic carrier sheet to further burnish over the top. At this point, I took out my embossing medium again, and I'm going to go over the top of this stencil, but I'm only going to use the word jardin, I think it's pronounced. I believe it means garden, and I'm just going to be going over that particular design there. When you're doing a raised stencil with embossing medium, remember to lift your stencil straight up, don't slide it off. I'm then going to reposition the stencil, and I'm going to go over the top of the text and the year down the bottom. Now I wasn't 100% happy with how the smaller text turned out at this point, and I was actually worried that it crowded the design, so I actually removed it while I had to think about it. And then I grabbed this other piece from the same transfer, and I'm going to cut it apart because I want to spread these roses a little bit more and change the direction. So this one I'm going to be putting in the top right hand corner, and the other one I'm still having a bit of a think about how I'm going to position it. I'm going to peel off the backing of the design for the right there and then position it, and just as same as before, just rubbing and burnishing that down. Next, I'm going to be adding the other transfer up the top there, and again just burnishing that down. You can see that the design is unfinished on the right hand side there. I am going to be piecing that back together with some of the bits that I have cut off. I just wanted to position it a little bit differently. I didn't want to obscure the text down the bottom, so I had to rethink the design a little bit, but that's something to keep in mind. You can reorganize your transfers to suit the project that you're working with. I decided at this stage that I would try adding that other text, and I went in a little bit lighter with the embossing medium because it is a smaller text design, and it definitely worked a little bit better this time. Once I was finished adding the embossing medium, I did decide to add this little scrap of transfer on the left hand side there, just to bring the design up and to the left a little bit more. After this, I then sealed the entire book with satin clear coat. And here's a look at our spring book. I'm really pleased with how this turned out. I definitely tried a few different things with the raised stenciling, and I felt like less was more with this. I didn't want to go over the top. Let me know what you think of this in the comments. My first project, I'm going to be working on this hardcover book that I thrifted for $1. I'm going to be priming the surface first with Paint Couture's 2-in-1 primer in grey. I'm going to apply 2 coats of the primer over the entire outside of the book. I'm using primer for 2 reasons. 1, it's going to block the colour of the original cover, and 2, it's going to make sure that my paint sticks and stays there. Once my 2 coats of primer were completely dry, I took out Paint Couture's Purple Haze and also my custom mix here. This is 2 parts Purple Haze and 1 part Cozy Beige chalk paint. And I'm applying it to the front cover of the book to start off with. I'm just doing it in a dabbing and stippling motion. I'm going on a little bit thicker than I would usually because I'm going to be coming in and doing a little bit of blending and a little bit of color variation. I want this to have quite a moody feel. So bringing in the darker purple with the lighter purple and just sort of blending it all in, I'm hoping will create that look. So as you can see, I'm just moving the dark purple around, also grabbing some of the light purple again, just really having a play and dabbing at it. Because my paint is still wet, I'm able to blend these colors together. Once I'm finished with the front cover, I am going to repeat the same process on the back. When my paint was dry, I took out IOD's Rose Chintz Paint Inlay. I'm going to be putting this just on the front cover. I'm just working out the approximate size here. Ideally, I want the florals to be going up vertically, so that's why I've cut it this way. I'm then going to be using Paint Couture's Extreme Guard in Satin to use my paint inlay today. You need to apply a paint inlay to a wet top coat or some wet paint in order for it to actually work. I like to use clear coat. I'm then going to press my inlay into my wet clear coat and I'm just smoothing that out, really pressing it into that little groove there, and then I'm going to use my mister to thoroughly dampen the inlay and then a wet wipe to smooth it out and just to make sure that I have really good contact. I'm then going to let this dry completely. Once my inlay was completely dry, I then came in with my mister again and dampened that inlay again, and I gave it about 30 seconds and then I started to pull it back. And the thing I love about paint inlays is that they really do have a lovely hand painted look, and you never really know exactly how it's going to turn out, but it is lovely. I then came in with my water mister and added a little bit more water to my inlay, and I'm going to use a paintbrush to start to reactivate and really work those paint pigments that are in the inlay, because these are actual paint pigments, so you're able to come in and do this. Ultimately, my goal for this was to make this look a little bit more like a watercolor or a painting instead of it being a more perfect look. And I'm going to be adding water to each of the florals and repeating the same process. I'm just sort of mixing the colors up. If it gets a little bit too heavy, I can use a wet wipe to pull back some of it. I'm also cleaning off my brush in between some of the more intense colors like the reds. And if you're going to do this, this will be to your liking how much you do this. As I said, I wanted it to look very much hand painted, very much like a watercolor, and I definitely wanted to soften the details in the florals. So this is definitely something that you can do, and I've seen it be used with some of the blue inlays to get that flow blue look. But I thought I would give it a try with this beautiful, more colorful rose chintz design. This is definitely one of my favorites. It's definitely got a lovely cottage sort of feel. I'm also going to be adding a bit of water to some of the leaves as well, again to soften them. And some of them I'm actually changing the shape a little bit of the leaves. And again, to your own liking, this may be a little bit too much for you. I just really wanted it to have a hand painted look. Once I'm finished doing this, I did let this dry completely. Next, I'm going to seal the entire book with Paint Couture's Extreme Guard in Satin. Now, ordinarily, I would spray seal this first because, as you saw, you can reactivate the paint pigments with a water-based product. But I'm using a very light hand, and also if I do get a little bit of smearing, I actually don't mind. Remember, I want this to look hand painted. I want it to look a bit like a watercolor. So adding this is going to perhaps help add to that feel. When my book was dry, I took out IOD's Trimmings 1 mold. I'm going to add cornstarch to that center design there. Then I'm going to roll my clay out into a sausage sort of a shape, and then I'm going to start pushing that clay into that trim design. You definitely want to go slow here. It can be easy to have that clay sort of slip out, but I just sort of make sure I always have one hand in place, and then I run my fingers along and push out that excess clay. I'm then going to flex the mold and take the casting out. Next, I need to work out how much of the clay I need to cut off. So I've laid it on the book spine, and now I'm using a palette knife to cut off the excess. I'm then going to be using my Sealy's Quickset wood glue on the back of the castings, making sure I've got enough of that glue there, really spreading that out. And then I'm going to apply it to the spine of the book. I definitely had to mold this a little bit to the shape of the book spine itself, but just make sure you don't press too hard. I let my clay dry overnight, and the next day I took out Paint Couture's Bronze Luxe Metallic, and I'm just applying it to the spine section of the book first. And I really love how this metallic brings out the details in those beautiful IOD molds. If I inspire you to try any of the Paint Couture products used in today's video, I would really appreciate it if you would use my affiliate link. I will put it in the description and on the screen. I just get a little thank you from Paint Couture in return. Once the bronze was dry, I took out Paint Couture's embossing medium, and I'm going to take some of that out and put it in a plastic container. I'm also then going to put a few drops of the Bronze Luxe Metallic into the embossing medium to tint it. Ultimately, I want to use the bronze, so this is going to be a good in-between color. I'm then going to take out this stencil by JRV. This is from the mini jar label stencil pack, and as you can see, I'm just applying the embossing medium over the top of the stencil using my palette knife. I've always got one hand holding the stencil in place to make sure it doesn't slip around, and this is just going to give a lovely raised effect. It's going to make more of an impact than if I had have just stenciled straight on to the surface. I wanted my book to have quite an old world feel to it, and this stencil definitely achieves that. I'm going to peel the stencil up, and then when that's completely dry and you can see I have cleaned the stencil, then I'm going to go in with Paint Couture's Bronze Luxe Metallic over the top. And this is just going to really give a lovely shine and really make the design stand out. When the bronze was dry, I took out Paint Couture's Van Dyke Brown Glaze. I'm first applying it over the top of the mold on the spine of the book, and this is going to sit down into all of those beautiful details and give it that vintage old world look that I am going for. I'm then using a wet wipe to pull back some of the excess and really allow it to sit down in those details. I also wanted to add some to the front cover, so I'm focusing on the little indent there on the left hand side near the spine. I am pulling back quite a bit, as you can see from other areas. We've got that clear coat down, so I'm able to pull back a lot. I'm going to add it over the entire front cover, but again, I don't want this to look too dark, but I still want it to have that feeling of age. And obviously, if this was a little bit too much for you, you could leave this step out, or you could go in with a white wax and lighten it up. I'm also going to be adding some of that glaze to the back cover. Once the glaze was dry, I decided to take out my brush that I'd used with the bronze, and I'm just going to run that over the top of the areas where the bronze is, just to bring back a little bit more of that shine. And here's a look at our finished project. I'm really pleased with how this turned out. I think the paint inlay looks lovely with that water added to it, and the stencil definitely finishes off this book. Let me know what you think of this project in the comments. For our first project, I'm going to be using these hardcover books that I thrifted. I am going to be covering them with drop cloth. Now, I've done this before. I will make sure that I include the video where I have quite an in-depth tutorial on this. But basically, I've got the drop cloth, I've laid the book down on top of it, and I am just measuring out to make sure that it's going to fit each of the books the same. And then I'm going to cut out 3 lengths of the drop cloth. Because the drop cloth is a little bit see-through and my books are a few different colors, I'm going to paint each of them with 1 coat of Dixie Belle's Cashmere Chalk Mineral Paint. This is a lovely cream tone. It's going to be a really great base. I just didn't want to be able to see the different colors underneath. I felt like it would detract from the design that we're going to create. So each one of these is going to get 1 coat. Next, I'm going to use my little craft iron and I'm going to iron the drop cloth a little bit. This is just going to smooth it out a little bit to make there be less wrinkles when I'm covering each of the books. Next, we're going to start covering the books. I've laid out my drop cloth. I'm going to position my book and then I'm going to be using hot glue to attach it today. So I'm going to open up the cover. I'm going to lay down a strip of hot glue. Make sure you're being really careful while you're doing this. Then I'm going to lift the book up and then very carefully press the side of the drop cloth down. I'm just using a little transfer stick to do this so I don't burn my fingers. I'm repeating the same process on the other side, although I did have to trim off a little bit of excess drop cloth here. Make sure as you're doing this that you pull that drop cloth tight at all times. I'm then going to trim off some of the excess. You definitely want to do this, otherwise sometimes the drop cloth can become a little bit bulky and the book does not close properly. Next, I'm going to make a little cut near the spine of the book. This is so that we're able to fold part of the drop cloth over. I'm going to repeat the same process on both sides. Remember, you can find a full product list in the description of this video and most of these products on our website, theprovincialfarmhouse.com.au. If you don't have access to drop cloth to cover your books, you could perhaps use a different type of material, perhaps some burlap. You could also paint the books instead. It just depends what look you're going for. I really love the look of the drop cloth on the books. I feel like it just gives it a lovely, earthy, vintage, natural feel. My vision for this project today is vintage gardening books. I felt like I wanted to create something that would look really cute sitting on a coffee table, and I definitely wanted to use more of IOD's seed catalogue transfer. I'm a little bit obsessed with it right now. Once I have all the sides glued down, I'm going to trim off the excess from the top of the spine and glue down the excess drop cloth, and then I will repeat the same process for the bottom of the book as well. Once I'm finished covering my book, I need to decide how I'm going to decorate it. I'm going to use this lovely design from IOD's Seed Catalogue Transfer, and I'm placing the design on top of the book. This is the front cover. I've laid the transfer down and you can see I'm rubbing over the entire thing, and then I pick a corner and I start lifting that plastic as I'm rubbing. You definitely want to go slow here, especially if there's lots of small parts to your transfer. Drop cloth is really great for using transfers with. It does tend to stick really well, but I'm also bracing and holding the fabric down in places while I'm doing this so that I don't accidentally shift and pull that transfer off. I'm then going to burnish it really, really well. I'm then using a little piece of text that's from the same transfer pack. This is part of a design that I trimmed off in one of my previous videos. Here you especially need to hold that fabric in place while you are rubbing your transfer down. For our second book, I'm using another design from the Seed Catalogue. I'm repeating the same steps as before, peeling the backing off and then pressing my transfer down. So again, just be very mindful of the fact that you are putting this on drop cloth and it does tend to move and shift, and you want to just make sure that you're holding that still while you're doing that, and make sure you take your time. If you don't have access to these transfers, you could possibly use some decoupage paper instead. For the spine of this book, I'm going to take some text from the ephemeral melange transfer. I'm going to trim off part of that, and that's going to be on the side. I wanted to stick with sayings or titles that were floral related, so I felt that the ephemeral melange transfer paired really well with the Seed Catalogue design. If you don't have this particular transfer, you could perhaps use some stamps instead. For the third book, I'm going to grab another design from the Seed Catalogue. This is a really sweet one, and I'm glad that I can use it on this project. So again, I'm going to position it and then press down. Now, the difference between this one and the other transfers that we were using is this is one solid design. This definitely makes it a little bit easier when it comes to transferring your image because it's all attached. There's no little tiny pieces to forget or rip. It's all one piece and it makes it a lot easier to get that all down. So I'm working really hard on the spine of the book here because there is a little bit of an indent, and then I'm going to pick up a corner and start rubbing the design down. And you can see as I start to pull that plastic away, it is coming away really easily and quite quickly. For the spine of this book, I'm also taking a part of some text from the Ephemeral Melange transfer. I feel like this will pair really well. So I'm just trimming off the part that I need and then adding it to the spine of the book. Again, just go really slow here. There is some fabric here that's a little bit looser than on the cover, so you just definitely need to take your time. So these books that we've created today are decor pieces, but to make them last a little bit longer and protect them, I'm going to give each book 2 coats of Dixie Belle's flat clear coat. I feel like that this will protect the transfer, but it will also make that drop cloth a little bit stiffer, so it's probably less likely to wrinkle and crease and crack that transfer. So 2 coats of this just to add a little bit of extra protection. And here are our finished floral books. I'm really happy with how these turned out. I think that they would look really sweet on a coffee table, on a sideboard, anywhere really. Let me know what you think of these in the comments. For my first project, I'm going to be using this hardcover book that I thrifted. I'm going to be preparing the surface first with Paint Couture's 2-in-1 primer in grey. This is going to block the dark cover of the book coming through and also the gold lettering on the spine. I'm going to do 2 coats and let them dry for several hours. Next, I'm going to be using Paint Couture's Cozy Beige chalk paint, and I'm going to be applying 2 even coats to the entire outside of the book cover. Paint Couture's primer also does come in white, but I have grey open at the moment and I like to get through things before I open up brand new jars. So if you are going to be using a light colour, you can definitely opt to use that white primer instead. Once the Cozy Beige chalk paint was completely dry, I took out Paint Couture's Peace Mineral Paint. This is sort of like a French linen tone, and I'm going to go over the top of the front and back of the book. But as you can see, I'm not going for full coverage. I actually want to see some of that Cozy Beige peeking up underneath. I am hoping to have some gaps, hoping to have some areas that are a bit thinner. I'm then going to take out IOD's Lattice Rose Paint Inlay, and I'm going to be trimming off this grain sack stripe style design, and I'm going to be using that in the center of the book. My paint isn't completely dry, but I'm going to go in and add a little bit more of that Peace Mineral Paint because you must put paint inlays into wet paint or clear coat for them to work. So I'm going to press the inlay into the wet paint, smooth it down so that it has good contact, and then I'm going to come in with my mister, and the water helps to activate those paint pigments that are in the inlays. I'm also going to apply a little bit of pressure. Once my inlay was completely dry, I then took out my mister and misted that inlay again, and then I started to peel the inlay back after about 60 seconds. This is definitely a very satisfying part of using the paint inlays, and I love how they are imperfect. That's what we're going for. I'm then going to be using Redesign's Chateau de Savane stamp, and there's a lovely crest design that I want to use. I'm going to be using some black permanent ink on the back of the design, and then I'm going to be pressing that in the center. Now I've got it moved just a little bit up towards the top because I do want to add some text underneath down the bottom. I'm then going to be using some of this fabric that I thrifted. It's just some plain cream tone fabric. I want to add some of this to the spine of the book, so I'm just measuring out how much I'm going to need, and then I will trim it to size. To attach this fabric to the spine of the book, I'm going to be using Paint Couture's Decoupage Medium in Matte. I'm applying a generous amount to the cover of the book where I want the fabric to go, and then I'm going to press that fabric down into that wet medium. I also want to really focus on pushing that fabric into the crease of the spine of the book there, really highlighting that, and I really feel like this gives quite a vintage feel. I'm also going to apply some of that decoupage medium to the spine of the book as well, and obviously to the back, so we're basically decoupaging that fabric on. Once I have all of the fabric secured down, I'm going to go over the top of it with another coat of that decoupage medium. When that was dry, I took out IOD's Knob Topper stamp. Unfortunately, this is a retired design, and I'm just going to take some of this smaller text here, and I'm going to ink that up with IOD's permanent black ink, and I'm going to position that up the top on the spine of the book. Now I did get a little bit of a smudge here, but I'm going to be doing some distressing a bit later, so I'm not too worried. I'm then going to take out one of my JRV mini grain sack stencils here, and I'm going to be using Paint Couture's pitch black chalk paint to stencil this design on. I'm using a 1-inch JRV stencil brush. I really felt like this tied in well with the overall French feeling of the design, and basically I just wanted something also that sort of fit in with the shape, so it's got that lovely curved shape, so I definitely feel like it goes well with the crest stamp that we added. When the paint was dry, I took out some 220 grit sandpaper, and I'm just going to go over the top and lightly distress the design. So that way it will tie in a bit better with the more distressed look of the stamp above. As I said earlier, I'm also going to do a little bit of distressing on the ink on the spine of the book as well. Next, I'm going to be using Paint Couture's Light Brown Sugar Glaze. I'm going to be applying it over the front part of the cover first, remembering that the piece mineral paint actually has that built-in clear coat, so I'm going to be able to come in now and use a wet wipe and pull back as much or as little as I want. I like to do a bit of a dabbing and stippling sort of motion here to pull back that excess in an uneven manner. It just gives a more authentically aged look. I'm also going to be adding some of the glaze to the fabric that we attached to the spine. I'm going a lot lighter here because I know it's probably going to soak into the fabric a bit quicker than into that mineral paint. I'm also going on the spine of the book as well, and obviously the back. Finally, I'm going to add some hot glue to the indent on the front of the book cover there, and then attach some of this twine that I had in my stash, and I'm going to be wrapping it around just the spine section of the book. So I'm just going to continue adding strips of glue to secure the twine in place, and then I will wrap it around another 3 times, I think it was, and then once I'm happy with how that looks, I will be adding a little bit more glue on the back section to secure it in place and just get it to stay where I want it to go. And here's a look at our finished book. I'm really pleased with how this turned out. I know often I go in a more floral direction. This definitely feels a bit more vintage, French. Let me know what you think of this in the comments. For my last project today, I'm going to be taking this book that I thrifted, and I'm actually going to be peeling off the cover. So I'm going to pull back just the colored cover so that the paper remains underneath, and I'm just going to take my time and work slowly to pull that off. Now, not all of them turn out this well. Sometimes it's just luck, but I really love the effect that this creates. Once I have the cover removed, I'm going to be using Redesign's new Easter stamp design. There are so many beautiful elements to choose from here, but I did pick this design here because I loved the frame details. So I'm just going to take my permanent black ink, I'm going to ink up the top section first, and I'm going to pull away some of the excess. We're going to be creating a border. So I'm going to position that up the top there and press down, and obviously one hand is always in place while the other moves, and then I'm going to pull it straight up. If I get any ink where I don't want it, I can wipe a little bit of it off with a baby wipe. Now I'm just going to ink up part of the border, and you can see I'm pulling off the bottom section so that we can make it look a little bit more continuous, and then I'm going to line it up and press down. Now obviously it's not going to be perfect, it is going to look a little bit broken on the sides there, but that's okay. I'm just going to continue to add it, and it's just going to have a vintage look, and that's fine. We want this to look old and warm. Once I've added the last bit of the sides there, I'm going to ink up the top just like we did up the top of the book. I'm going to ink that up, and we're going to position that down at the bottom. So when you're looking at your stamps, remember you can use bits and pieces of them to create your own designs. You do not have to use them as is. I'm then going to take another one of the stamps with this beautiful bunny, and I'm going to position that in the center of our book, and that is going to be the main focus of the book there. I want this to be something that could be used outside of Easter and spring, so I didn't want to add any text to make it season specific. Once I'm finished stamping, I did heat set the ink with a hairdryer, and now I'm going to take Paint Couture's light brown sugar glaze, and I'm just going to add it to the spine of the book first. Next, I'm going to add some water to a plastic container just so I can water down a little bit of that glaze to go on the front cover as well. I just felt like it would be a bit too heavy at full strength, so watering it down allows me to apply it over our stamp design. It doesn't obscure it, but it does give it a lovely vintage feel. I'm also going to be applying the same watered down mix to the back of the book. If you don't have access to glaze, a watered down brown paint mix could also achieve a similar result. Once my book was completely dry, I took some twine and I'm going to wrap it around my book a few times. Now, obviously you could leave it here. You don't have to add anything else, but I wanted to add something a little bit more spring specific that could be taken off if whoever has this book wants to. So I'm going to cut off the length that I want. I'm going to then grab this sweet little nest that I got online, and I'm actually going to thread the twine through the nest itself, over and under, so that we can hold it in place, and then I'm going to tie a simple bow as well. I'm then going to take some clay that I had lying around that had started to dry out a little bit. I've added a little bit of water to it. Now I'm rolling it up in my hands. I'm going to roll it into a little bit of a ball or an oval shape to make it look like a little egg to sit in the nest. Now I did that twice so that we had 2 of those eggs. I'm then going to take some of my Gorilla Super Glue gel, and I'm going to add some little dots of it into the nest. And then I'm going to take some of this forest moss that I got online. I will link it in the description. And I'm going to press that into the glue there. And then once I've done that, I'm going to add some glue to each of the eggs to stick those in place. And here's our finished spring book. I love how this turned out, and I think adding that nest just gives it that something special. Let me know what you think of this in the comments. For our final project, I'm going to be using this book that I thrifted. I'm going to actually be peeling back the color cover to leave the paper cover. I have a more detailed video on this that I can link below, but basically you're pulling the design off and just leaving the paper underneath. And I love doing this because they look so old and vintage, and often they have hidden signs of age under there as well. It is a little bit time consuming, so if you want to paint your books instead, I completely understand, but I definitely feel like it's worth it. So I've peeled the entire cover off, and then I've grabbed this design from the label masterboard, and again I'm trimming that. I'm keeping it nice and neat this time because again this would have been a professionally done project. So then I'm going to use some of Dixie Belle's flat clear coat to decoupage the design down in the center. I'm laying down a strip of product first and then smoothing the design down with my brush. I've still got a little bit of product on it. Then I'm lifting up the rest of the design and repeating the same process, pressing the design down. I decided to work in steps here because it was a bit of a longer design, but again, this is going to be to your personal preference. Next, I grabbed out my JRV Apothecary labels again. I'm going to tape off the area that I don't want to use. I'm going to be stenciling on the spine of the book. I'm using the Anchor Silk Mineral Paint again, and I want this to be a pretty faded design, so I'm not being super heavy with my paint. And then once that's dry, I'm using some 220 grit sandpaper to sand it back. I then sealed the front and back of the book with Dixie Belle's flat clear coat. Next, I decided to use one of the borders from the Adornment Stamp. I felt like these had a very vintage feel so that they would go beautifully with this project. So I've peeled off the design that I want to use. I then have some clear plastic that I'm using as my clear mount, and then I'm using some of IOD's permanent black ink. I'm going to be positioning this border stamp around the edges of our decoupaged label. So I'm positioning it and then carefully pressing down. Now, I don't need this to be perfect. Remember, this is going to give us a vintage feel. It's going to look like a really old, worn and weathered book. So I'm not worried about perfection here. So I'm going to apply the stamp either side, and then I'm going to ink up part of the stamp to do the top and the bottom. Now, I did miss a little bit on the top right there. You can see I'm just fixing that up. And then I'm adding the stamp up the top and the bottom. Again, I've rubbed off some of the excess ink to do this. I'm then going to add it to the border as well, and I really like how the end of this stamp sort of frames the little title. It looks almost intentional here. That was a happy accident. And then I'm going to use some 220 grit sandpaper to lightly distress the book back. And here's our finished vintage style book. I'm really happy with how this turned out. It was super easy using that decoupage paper to give a plain thrifted book a makeover, and it goes beautifully with the IOD stamps. Let me know what you think of this in the comments. I really hope that you enjoyed this video collection, and you can find the products used in this video on our website, theprovincialfarmhouse.com.au. If you haven't already, I would love it if you would hit that subscribe button, like, comment, and share this out to a friend that you think might enjoy it.